Daniel Reed arrived at Fort Jackson on a gray Tuesday morning in March. He stepped off the bus with the other recruits, but something about him was different. While the others joked nervously and sized each other up, Reed just stood there, eyes forward, face blank, like a man who had already seen too much to care about first impressions. He was 23 years old, average height, lean build. Nothing about him stood out. No tattoos, no swagger, no loud voice trying to prove something. He carried his duffel bag to the barracks, found his bunk, and started unpacking without saying a word to anyone. Private Martinez, who had the bunk next to him, tried to start a conversation. "Hey man, where you from?" Reed glanced at him, gave a small nod, and went back to unpacking. Martinez shrugged and looked at the guy across the aisle. "Guess we got a quiet one." That was the first day. It didn't get better. Basic training at Fort Jackson was designed to break soldiers down and build them back up. Drill sergeants screamed in faces, pushed bodies to their limits, and tested every recruit's mental strength. Most of the new soldiers adapted. They learned to move fast, shout loud, and never show weakness. Reed couldn't keep up. During morning runs, he was always at the back of the formation. His legs seemed to give out halfway through, and he would stumble the rest of the way while the drill sergeants screamed at him to move faster. During push-ups, his arms trembled after just a few reps, and he would collapse onto the ground while everyone else kept going. It didn't make sense. He was young, he looked fit enough, but his body seemed to betray him at every turn. Sergeant First Class Morrison noticed him on the third day. Morrison was a 15-year veteran with 2 combat deployments and 0 tolerance for weakness. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a shaved head and a voice that could cut through concrete. He had trained hundreds of soldiers, and he prided himself on knowing exactly who would make it and who wouldn't. When he saw Reed struggling through the obstacle course, something inside him snapped. "Reed!" he bellowed, marching over to where the young soldier was trying to pull himself over a wall. "What the hell is wrong with you? My grandmother could climb faster than that, and she's been dead for 10 years. Reed didn't respond. He just kept trying, his arms shaking, his face twisted with effort. Morrison grabbed him by the collar and pulled him down. "Look at me when I'm talking to you, Private." Reed looked at him. His eyes were calm, too calm, like he was somewhere else entirely. "You think you can just float through my training? You think the Army is some kind of charity program for people who can't hack it?" "No, Sergeant," Reed said quietly. "Then why are you wasting my time? Why are you wasting everyone's time?" Morrison gestured at the other recruits, who had stopped to watch. "These soldiers are here to become warriors. What are you here for?" Reed was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "To serve, Sergeant." Morrison laughed, a harsh, mocking laugh. "To serve? You can barely stand up straight. You want to serve? Go work at a McDonald's. At least there you won't get anyone killed." He shoved Reed toward the back of the formation. "Get out of my sight. And tomorrow, you better show me something, or I'll have you discharged before the week is out." Reed rejoined the group without a word. Martinez caught his eye and gave him a sympathetic look, but Reed just stared ahead, his face as blank as ever. That night, while the other recruits slept, Reed sat alone on the floor by his bunk, his hand pressed against his chest, fingers tracing something beneath his shirt. His breathing was slow, controlled, like a man trying to manage pain that never quite went away. No one saw him. No one asked. The next few weeks were brutal for Daniel Reed. Every morning started the same way, Morrison singling him out, finding new ways to humiliate him in front of the entire company. If Reed fell behind during runs, Morrison made him do extra laps while everyone watched. If Reed struggled with push-ups, Morrison stood over him, counting out loud, making sure everyone heard each pathetic number. 15. That's it. My daughter can do more than that, Reed, and she's 7 years old. The other recruits started to notice. Some of them felt sorry for Reed, but most of them just wanted to distance themselves from him. In basic training, weakness was contagious. If you associated with the weak link, you became a target too. Martinez was one of the few who still talked to him. "Hey man," he said one night, sitting on the edge of Reed's bunk. "You okay? Morrison's riding you pretty hard." Reed shrugged. "I'm fine." "You don't look fine. You look like you're about to collapse every time we do PT." "I said I'm fine." Martinez studied him for a moment. "Is there something going on? Something medical? Because if there is, you should talk to someone. Get it documented." They can't kick you out for a legitimate condition. Reed's jaw tightened. There's nothing to document. Come on, man. I'm trying to help you. I don't need help. Reed's voice was flat, final. I just need to get through this. Martinez sighed and stood up. All right, but if you change your mind, I'm here. He walked away, and Reed was alone again. The truth was, there was something going on, something Reed had never told anyone at Fort Jackson, something he had buried so deep that even thinking about it made his chest burn. 3 months before arriving at basic training, Daniel Reed had been a different person entirely. He had been a firefighter in Sacramento, California. Not just any firefighter, one of the best. He had joined the department at 20, driven by a need to help people, to save lives, to be part of something bigger than himself. Within 2 years, he had earned a reputation as the guy who would go into buildings that everyone else had given up on. His captain called him the Ghost because of how he moved through smoke and flame like it couldn't touch him. But 3 months ago, everything changed. There was a warehouse fire on the east side of the city. An old industrial building, abandoned for years, that had become a shelter for homeless families during the winter. By the time the trucks arrived, the entire structure was engulfed in flames. Reed was the first one in. He found them on the 3rd floor, a mother and her 2 children, huddled in a corner, surrounded by fire. The floor was collapsing. The ceiling was coming down. Every instinct told him to get out, to save himself, but he couldn't leave them. He carried the children out first, one under each arm, running through flames that burned through his gear and into his skin. He went back for the mother. The floor gave way just as he reached her. He fell 2 stories, shielding her body with his own. The mother survived. Reed's chest was crushed. The doctors said it was a miracle he lived. 3 broken ribs, a collapsed lung, internal bleeding that nearly killed him twice on the operating table. He spent 6 weeks in the hospital and another 2 months in physical therapy. But the physical wounds weren't the worst part. The worst part was the guilt. Because while Reed was falling through that floor, his partner, his best friend, a man named Tommy Ortiz, had gone in after him. Tommy didn't make it out. Reed survived. Tommy didn't. And no matter how many times people told him it wasn't his fault, Reed couldn't shake the feeling that he should have died in that building instead. So he quit the fire department. He couldn't face his crew, couldn't walk past Tommy's empty locker, couldn't look at the memorial they put up in the station. He needed to start over, to find a new way to serve, to prove that his survival meant something. That's why he joined the army. But his body hadn't fully healed. The ribs had mended, but the lung capacity wasn't what it used to be. The strength hadn't come back all the way. Every run, every push-up, every physical challenge reminded him of what he had lost, and what it had cost. He never told anyone at Fort Jackson. He had hidden his medical history, fudged the forms, done whatever it took to get through the recruitment process. He figured he could push through the pain, rebuild himself, become the soldier he needed to be. He was wrong. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon, 6 weeks into basic training. The company was doing a field exercise, a simulated combat scenario that tested everything they had learned. Teams had to navigate through a wooded area, complete objectives, and make it back to base before sundown. It was supposed to be a final test before graduation. Reed's team was led by Sergeant Morrison. From the start, Morrison made it clear that Reed was a liability. He assigned him to the back of the formation, told him to stay out of the way, and warned the other soldiers not to slow down for him. If Reed can't keep up, we leave him behind, Morrison said. This is war. We don't wait for the weak. The exercise went smoothly for the first few hours. The team moved through the woods, completed their first 2 objectives, and was making good time toward the extraction point. Reed stayed at the back, struggling with every step, but refusing to quit. Then everything went wrong. They were crossing a ravine when one of the younger soldiers, a private named Chen, lost his footing on a wet log and fell into the water below. The current was stronger than it looked, and Chen was swept downstream before anyone could react. "Man down," someone shouted. Morrison barked orders, sending 2 soldiers to find a safe crossing point downstream. But by the time they got there, Chen had been carried around a bend and out of sight. "We need to go in after him," Martinez yelled. "No one goes in that water," Morrison said. "It's too dangerous. We wait for." He didn't get to finish. Daniel Reed was already moving. Before anyone could stop him, Reed sprinted toward the edge of the ravine and dove into the churning water. The current grabbed him immediately, pulling him downstream with terrifying speed. Reed, get back here!" Morrison screamed, but it was too late. The other soldiers watched in shock as Reed fought through the water, his arms slicing through the current with a power and precision that none of them had ever seen from him before. He moved like a different person, like someone who had done this 100 times, who knew exactly how to read the water, how to position his body, how to conserve energy while making progress. He reached Chen in less than a minute. The young soldier was panicking, thrashing wildly, going under. Reed grabbed him from behind, locked his arms around Chen's chest, and started swimming toward the shore. The current fought him every inch of the way, but Reed didn't stop. He kicked, pulled, pushed, until finally, they reached the bank. Reed dragged Chen onto dry land and collapsed beside him, chest heaving, body shaking. Martinez and the others came running. "Holy crap!" Martinez breathed. "Reed, where did that come from?" Reed didn't answer. He was too busy trying to breathe, his hand pressed against his chest, his face twisted in pain. Chen was coughing up water, but he was alive. He looked at Reed with wide, disbelieving eyes. You saved me." Reed just nodded, still unable to speak. Morrison arrived last. He stood over Reed, staring down at him with an expression that was impossible to read. "Get him up," Morrison said finally. "We're moving out." No one mentioned what had just happened for the rest of the exercise, but something had shifted. The other soldiers looked at Reed differently now, not with pity, but with confusion. Who was this guy? Where had that come from? And Morrison said nothing. But that night, after everyone had returned to base, he went to the administrative building and started asking questions. Colonel William Hayes was not having a good day. The commander of Fort Jackson's Basic Training Brigade had spent the morning dealing with a logistics nightmare, the afternoon in back-to-back meetings, and was looking forward to going home when Sergeant Morrison appeared at his door. "Sir, I need to speak with you. It's urgent." Hayes sighed and gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Make it quick, Sergeant." Morrison sat down, but he didn't look comfortable. He looked like a man who had just discovered something that shook everything he thought he knew. "Sir, it's about one of my recruits, Private First Class Daniel Reed, the one you've been writing up every other day." Morrison's jaw tightened. "Yes, sir. Him. What about him?" Morrison hesitated. "After today's exercise, I started digging. Something didn't add up. The way he moved in that water. I've seen combat swimmers who couldn't do what he did, but his file says he has no prior military experience, no specialized training, nothing." Hayes raised an eyebrow. So I made some calls, talked to some people in Sacramento, where he's from, and I found something." He pulled a folder from under his arm and placed it on the colonel's desk. "This came through about an hour ago. It's his real file. The one he didn't want us to see." Hayes opened the folder. His eyes scanned the first page, then the second. By the third page, his face had gone pale. "Mother of God," he whispered. The file told a story that Daniel Reed had never shared with anyone at Fort Jackson. Before joining the Army, Reed had been a firefighter, but not just any firefighter. He had been one of the most decorated first responders in Sacramento's history. In 3 years, he had personally saved 17 lives from burning buildings. He had received the Medal of Valor, the highest honor a civilian first responder could earn. The governor had shaken his hand. The mayor had given him a key to the city. And then there was the warehouse fire. Hayes read the incident report 3 times. He read about the mother and children Reed had saved. He read about the 2-story fall. He read about the injuries, the broken ribs, the collapsed lung, the internal bleeding. He read about the 6 weeks in the hospital, the months of physical therapy, the doctors who said Reed would never fully recover. And he read about Tommy Ortiz. Hayes looked up at Morrison. "He hid all of this?" "Yes, sir. Falsified his medical forms, lied about his history, did whatever he had to do to get in." "Why?" Morrison shook his head. "I don't know, sir. Guilt, maybe. His partner died in that fire. Maybe he's trying to, I don't know, make up for it somehow." Hayes closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. "And you've been writing him for 6 weeks." Morrison's face reddened. "I didn't know, sir. He never said anything. He just took it. Because that's what heroes do, Sergeant. They don't complain. They don't make excuses. They just keep going, even when everything inside them is broken. The room was silent for a long moment. Finally, Hayes stood up. Where is Reed now? Medical bay, sir. He pushed himself too hard during the rescue. They're checking his lung. Hayes grabbed the folder and headed for the door. Come with me, Sergeant. We have a wrong to make right. The medical bay was quiet when Colonel Hayes and Sergeant Morrison arrived. A few soldiers sat on cots nursing minor injuries, but most of the beds were empty. In the far corner, behind a thin curtain, Daniel Reed lay still, eyes closed, an oxygen mask over his face. The doctor, a captain named Williams, met them at the door. How is he? Hayes asked. Stable, sir, but his left lung is compromised. Old injury that never fully healed. He's been pushing through pain that would have stopped most people weeks ago. Williams shook his head. Honestly, sir, I don't know how he's been doing it. Hayes nodded grimly. I do. He walked to Reed's bedside and stood there for a moment, looking down at the young man who had hidden so much, endured so much, and never asked for anything in return. Reed's eyes opened. When he saw the colonel, he tried to sit up. At ease, soldier, Hayes said gently. Stay where you are. Reed relaxed slightly, but his eyes were wary. He knew that colonels didn't visit privates in the medical bay unless something was wrong. Sir, if this is about my file, it is. Reed closed his eyes. I understand, sir. I'll accept whatever punishment. Shut up, son. Reed's eyes snapped open. Hayes pulled a chair over and sat down beside the bed. Morrison stood behind him, looking like he wished he could disappear. I've read your file, Hayes said. Your real file. Sacramento Fire Department. Medal of Valor. 17 lives saved. The warehouse fire. He paused. Tommy Ortiz. Reed's jaw tightened at the name, but he said nothing. You want to tell me why a man with your record, a genuine hero, is hiding in basic training, letting himself be treated like garbage? Reed was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Tommy died because of me. That's not what the report says. The report is wrong. Reed's eyes glistened. I went in too deep. I took a risk I shouldn't have taken. Tommy came in to save me, and he didn't make it out. That's on me. That's always going to be on me. Hayes leaned forward. So you came here to punish yourself? I came here to serve, to do something that mattered, to prove that Tommy's death wasn't for nothing. By hiding who you are, by letting people like Morrison, he glanced back at the sergeant, treat you like dirt. I deserve it. No. Hayes's voice was firm. No, you don't. He reached into the folder and pulled out a photograph. It was from a Sacramento newspaper. Reed standing in front of the burned warehouse, holding one of the children he had saved. The headline read, Local Hero Saves 3 from Inferno. This is who you are, Daniel. Not a failure. Not a liability. A hero. A man who runs into fire when everyone else runs out. A man who jumps into freezing water to save a fellow soldier without thinking twice. Reed stared at the photograph, his eyes wet. Tommy didn't die because of you, Hayes continued. Tommy died because he was a hero too. He made a choice, the same choice you would have made if the positions were reversed. You don't honor his memory by destroying yourself. You honor it by living, by continuing to serve, by being the man he knew you were. Reed couldn't speak. The tears were falling now, streaming down his face, and he couldn't stop them. Morrison stepped forward. His voice was rough, choked with emotion. Reed, Daniel, I owe you an apology. I didn't know. I should have looked deeper. I should have asked why instead of just assuming. He trailed off, shaking his head. I was wrong, and I'm sorry. Reed looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. You were doing your job, Sergeant. My job is to train soldiers, not break them. And you, Morrison swallowed hard. You're the strongest soldier I've ever seen. Not because of your body, because of what's in here. He tapped his own chest. I should have seen that from day one. 2 days later, the entire company assembled on the parade grounds. No one knew why. The announcement had simply said, mandatory formation, with no further explanation. Rumors flew through the barracks. Some thought it was an inspection, others thought someone was getting discharged. Daniel Reed stood in the back of the formation, still recovering from his time in the medical bay. His chest ached, his lungs burned, but he was standing. That was all that mattered. Colonel Hayes walked onto the stage, followed by Sergeant Morrison and several other senior officers. The company snapped to attention. "At ease," Hayes said. "I've gathered you all here today because there's something you need to know. Something about one of your fellow soldiers." He paused, letting the tension build. Private First Class Daniel Reed, front and center. A murmur rippled through the formation. Reed's stomach dropped, but he did as he was told. He walked to the front of the company and stood at attention before the colonel. Hayes turned to address the entire formation. "Most of you know Private Reed as the soldier who struggled, the one who couldn't keep up, the one who Sergeant Morrison," he glanced at Morrison, "worked especially hard." Nervous laughter from a few soldiers. Morrison's face reddened. "What you don't know is who Daniel Reed really is." Hayes pulled out the folder. Before joining the Army, Private Reed was a firefighter in Sacramento, California. In 3 years, he personally saved 17 lives from burning buildings. He received the Medal of Valor, the highest honor a civilian first responder can earn. The formation went dead silent. 3 months before arriving here, Private Reed entered a burning warehouse to save a mother and her 2 children. He carried those children out through fire that burned through his protective gear. He went back for the mother. The floor collapsed. He fell 2 stories, shielding her body with his own. Hayes's voice was steady, but heavy with emotion. He suffered 3 broken ribs, a collapsed lung, and internal bleeding. He spent 6 weeks in the hospital. Doctors told him he might never fully recover. His partner, his best friend, died in that same fire trying to save him. Reed stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, fighting to keep his composure. Private Reed hid all of this when he enlisted. He concealed his injuries, falsified his medical forms, because he wanted to serve, because he felt guilty for surviving when his friend didn't, because he believed he had something to prove. Hayes stepped closer to Reed. 2 days ago, during a training exercise, Private Reed jumped into a freezing river to save Private Chen, who had fallen in and was drowning. He did this without hesitation, without orders, without thinking about his own safety, because that's who he is. That's who he's always been. He turned to face the formation. This is what a hero looks like. Not someone who brags about their accomplishment. Not someone who demands recognition. Someone who shows up, does the work, and saves lives, even when no one is watching, even when it costs them everything. Hayes faced Reed again. "Private Reed, on behalf of the United States Army, I want to apologize. We failed you. We should have seen who you were from the beginning. Instead, we let our assumptions blind us." He reached into his pocket and pulled out something that glinted in the sunlight. "It's not much, but I hope it's a start." He pinned a commendation medal onto Reed's chest. "For exceptional valor and selfless service. You've earned this, soldier, and you've earned the respect of everyone on this field." The formation erupted. It started with Martinez, a single pair of hands clapping. Then Chin joined in, tears streaming down his face. Then the soldier next to him, and the next, until the entire company was applauding, cheering, shouting Reed's name. Sergeant Morrison stepped forward. He snapped to attention and rendered a sharp salute. "It's an honor to serve with you, Private Reed." One by one, every soldier in the formation followed suit. Privates, corporals, sergeants, they all saluted the young man who had hidden his pain, endured their scorn, and saved one of their own without asking for anything in return. Reed stood there, overwhelmed, tears streaming down his face. For the first time since Tommy's death, he didn't feel like a failure. He didn't feel like he should have died instead. He felt like maybe, just maybe, his survival had meant something after all. 6 months later, Private First Class Daniel Reed graduated from advanced individual training at the top of his class. His lung capacity had improved with proper treatment and physical therapy. His strength had returned. But more importantly, something inside him had healed, something that medicine couldn't fix. He had learned to forgive himself. The day before his graduation, Reed visited a small cemetery in Sacramento. He walked through the rows of headstones until he found the one he was looking for. Tommy Ortiz, beloved son, brother, friend, a hero who gave everything. Reed knelt in front of the grave and placed a small medal on the stone, the commendation he had received at Fort Jackson. "I don't know if you can hear me, Tommy," he said quietly, "but I wanted you to know. I'm okay. I'm finally okay." He touched the headstone, feeling the cool granite beneath his fingers. "I spent so long thinking I should have died with you, thinking that surviving was some kind of punishment. But I understand now. You didn't die because of me. You died because you were brave, because you were a hero, because that's who you were." Tears rolled down his cheeks, but he didn't wipe them away. "I'm going to keep going, Tommy. I'm going to keep serving. I'm going to save as many lives as I can, for both of us. And every time I help someone, every time I make a difference, you'll be right there with me." He stood up, took a deep breath, and smiled. "Save me a seat up there, brother. I'll see you again someday, but not yet. I've still got work to do." He saluted the grave, then turned and walked away. Behind him, the morning sun broke through the clouds, casting golden light across the cemetery. And somewhere, somehow, Reed felt like Tommy was smiling. Daniel Reed's military career became the stuff of legend. He served 2 tours overseas, earning a Bronze Star for his actions during a rescue mission in Afghanistan. He saved 11 soldiers during his deployment, pulling them from burning vehicles, carrying them through enemy fire, doing whatever it took to bring his brothers and sisters home. When he finally retired from the Army, he didn't disappear into obscurity. He went back to Sacramento and rejoined the fire department, not as a frontline firefighter, but as a trainer. He spent the next 20 years teaching young recruits how to save lives, how to manage fear, how to push through pain when everything inside them screamed to give up. He told them about Tommy. He told them about Fort Jackson. He told them that the greatest heroes were often the ones who didn't look like heroes, the quiet ones, the struggling ones, the ones who carried wounds that no one could see. "Never assume you know someone's story," he would say. "Never judge someone by their worst moment. And never, ever give up on someone who's fighting a battle you can't see." Martinez stayed in touch. So did Chen, who credited Reed with saving his life twice, once in that river, and once by showing him what true courage looked like. Even Morrison reached out years later, now a retired command sergeant major, to thank Reed for teaching him the most important lesson of his career. "I was so focused on weeding out weakness," Morrison wrote in a letter, "that I almost destroyed the strongest soldier I ever trained. You taught me that strength isn't about how fast you run or how many push-ups you can do. It's about what you carry inside, and how you keep going when no one believes in you." Reed kept that letter in his desk for the rest of his life. On his 70th birthday, the Sacramento Fire Department held a ceremony in his honor. Hundreds of people came, firefighters he had trained, soldiers he had served with, families of people he had saved. They told stories, shared memories, and thanked him for everything he had given. When it was Reed's turn to speak, he looked out at the crowd and smiled. "I've been called a hero more times than I can count," he said. "But I want you to know something. The real heroes are the ones who never get recognized, the ones who show up every day and do the hard work without expecting anything in return, the ones who carry scars, visible and invisible, and keep going anyway." He paused, his eyes finding a photograph on the wall, a young firefighter with a bright smile and fearless eyes. "Tommy Ortiz was a hero. He saved my life, and he paid for it with his own. I've spent every day since then trying to be worthy of that sacrifice. I don't know if I've succeeded, but I know I've tried." He raised his glass. "To the quiet heroes, to the ones who struggle in silence, to the ones who never give up, even when the world gives up on them. This is for you." The room raised their glasses in return. And somewhere, in that moment, Daniel Reed felt a hand on his shoulder, warm, familiar, proud. He smiled, knowing exactly who it was. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another powerful story. Drop a comment below and tell us, have you ever misjudged someone only to discover they were a hidden hero? We'd love to hear your story.